For the next 2 weeks they would ride by night. They would make no fire. They had struck the shoes from their horses and filled the nail holes in with clay, and those who still had tobacco used their pouches to spit in, and they slept in caves and on bare stone. They rode their horses through the tracks of their dismounting, and they buried their stool like cats, and they barely spoke at all. Crossing those barren gravel reefs in the night, they seemed remote and without substance, like a patrol condemned to ride out some ancient curse, a thing surmised from the blackness by the creak of leather and the chink of metal. They cut the throats of the pack animals and jerked and divided the meat, and they traveled under the cape of the wild mountains upon a broad soda plain with dry thunder to the south and rumors of light. Under a gibbous moon, horse and rider spancelled to their shadows on the snow-blue ground, and in each flare of lightning as the storm advanced, those self-same forms rearing with a terrible redundancy behind them, like some third aspect of their presence, hammered out black and wild upon the naked grounds. They rode on. They rode like men invested with a purpose whose origins were antecedent to them, like blood legatees of an order both imperative and remote. For although each man among them was discreet unto himself, conjoined they made a thing that had not been before, and in that communal soul were wastes hardly reckonable, more than those whited regions on old maps where monsters do live, and where there is nothing other of the known world save conjectural winds. That night they were visited with a plague of hail out of a faultless sky, and the horses shied and moaned, and the men dismounted and sat upon the ground with their saddles over their heads, while the hail leaped in the sand like small lucent eggs concocted alchemically out of the desert darkness. When the company set forth in the evening, they continued south as before. The tracks of the murderers bore on to the west, but they were white men who preyed on travelers in that wilderness and disguised their work to be that of the savages. Notions of chance and fate are the preoccupation of men engaged in rash undertakings. The trail of the Argonauts terminated in ashes, as told, and in the congruence of such vectors, in such a waste wherein the hearts and enterprise of one small nation have been swallowed up and carried off by another, the ex-priest asked if some might not see the hand of a cynical god conducting, with what austerity and what mock surprise so lethal a congruence. The posting of witnesses by a third and other path altogether might also be called in evidence as appearing to beggar chance, yet the judge, who had put his horse forward until he was abreast of the speculants, said that in this was expressed the very nature of the witness, and that his proximity was no third thing, but rather the prime, for what could be said to occur unobserved. They moved like migrants under a drifting star, and their track across the land reflected in its faint arcature the movements of the earth itself. To the west the cloud banks stood above the mountains, like the dark warp of the very firmament, and the star-sprent reaches of the galaxy hung in a vast aura above the riders' heads. On the third night they crouched in the keep of old walls of slumped mud with the fires of the enemy not a mile distant on the desert. The judge sat with the Apache boy before the fire, and it watched everything with dark, berry eyes, and some of the men played with it, and made it laugh, and they gave it jerky, and it sat chewing and watching gravely the figures that passed above it. They covered it with a blanket, and in the morning the judge was dandling it on one knee, while the men saddled their horses. Toadvine saw him with the child as he passed with his saddle, but when he came back 10 minutes later leading his horse, the child was dead, and the judge had scalped it. Toadvine put the muzzle of his pistol against the great dome of the judge's head. "God damn you, Holden. You either shoot or take that away. Do it now." Toadvine put the pistol in his belt. The judge smiled and wiped the scalp on the leg of his trousers, and rose and turned away. Another 10 minutes and they were on the plain again, in full flight from the Apaches. On the 21st of July, in the year 1849, they rode into the city of Chihuahua to a hero's welcome, driving the harlequin horses before them through the dust of the streets in a pandemonium of teeth and whited eyes, Small boys ran among the hooves, and the victors in their gory rags smiled through the filth and the dust and the caked blood as they bore on poles the desiccated heads of the enemy through that fantasy of music and flowers.